Hi, thanks everyone. Welcome for being here on such a beautiful fall morning. And I hope we can get through this fast enough so we can all go and play this afternoon. I started to put some of my internet links into chat. There's a couple more I need to add. Maybe if I can't get them done, I'll put them in at the end, or maybe Rick or Isaiah can put them in. All right, first of all, I tend to talk softly. So I'm going to stay close to the camera so you can hear me. So if anyone has any trouble hearing me, let me know. My background academically was in economics. I got an undergrad degree, master's degree. Then in the late 80s, I became a state budget and economic analyst for the state of Washington in Olympia, Washington, where I had gone to school for my undergrad at the Evergreen State College. And I worked for 2.5 years in a big agency, something like HCD, but it was, Housing and Community Development. That's what we'll be talking about today. And but it was a health and human services agency. So I'm pretty familiar with state agency bureaucracy, which I think helps me figure out what's going on here. Then I went back to grad school, but had a career change, and somehow I spent 20 years working for UC, and at the end as a science editor and writer for the College of Chemistry at UC Berkeley. That was a very interesting career. That was serendipity. I'm glad that happened. And along the way, I was served on my local school board from 2002 to 2006, and on my city council from 2012 to 2020 for 8 years, and we term out after that in my little city of Albany. As Rick mentioned, I'm still active in Cali. And before we start, there's one thing I just want to say that as Californians, you should all be proud of. So bear with me for 30 seconds. In the history of the Nobel Prize, there have only been 7 female winners in chemistry. The first 2 were mother-daughter, Maria Curie in 1911 and her daughter in, I think, 1935. There was an X-ray crystallographer, Frances Crowfoot Hutchins, in 1964, and then early in the 2000s, there's a woman whose last name is Yona, and I frankly don't know what she did. But then there's been a run lately. 2018, Frances Arnold, 2020, Jennifer Doudna, 2022, Carolyn Bertozzi. And what you should be proud of is that they were all Californians, and all 3 of them were either faculty or students or both at the University of Berkeley College of Chemistry. So I've written and photographed and interviewed them. And it's pretty impressive that almost half of all the female Nobel laureates in chemistry came from UC Berkeley in the last 4 years. So that's my pitch on that. Now let me get going. Can we roll the slides, please, Rick?
Sure, just give me 1 second here. Y'all see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Okay, so here we go. Playing the housing numbers game. That actually is a quote from the Bay Area Council and how they were proud of how they kind of manipulated RHNA by sponsoring the bill SB 828. And they were successful. RHNA has been rigged. My apologies here. I know today is October 29, not October 28. Real briefly, this is based on a presentation I gave back in August to the Catalyst for Change group. And there's a link there in the chat already. But lots and lots has happened since then. So I want to kind of whiz through the first part of this and then focus on the end on the updated information. So next slide, please. So basically, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the brief history of this thing called RHNA. We're going to discuss towards the end the RHNA audit, and then where do we go from here? Next slide, please. Okay, so the California Department of Housing and Community Development is the agency responsible for RHNA. RHNA basically was created in about 1969. We are at the beginning of the 6th RHNA cycle. And So let me just give you the quick quote here. In order to create a housing plan, AKA a housing element, RHNA is part of the housing element, showing it can meet local housing needs, a jurisdiction must first know how much housing it must plan for. This is determined by a process called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Notice the word plan. When RHNA was first developed, it was a planning process, not a production process. This becomes very critical later. But the original intention of RHNA was just a planning process. Okay, next slide, please. Here's the bad news. RHNA never worked. Even by 2003, the Public Policy Institute of California published a pretty scathing review of RHNA that showed that compliance with RHNA had no effect on how much housing was built. Developers typically exceeded their RHNA targets for market rate housing, another critical issue. That was true through the 5th cycle, but they ended up not really paying much attention to where the cities planned for housing to go. They chose their own sites. And well, can we scroll down a little bit there? Oops, no, go back to the previous slide, please, there. There's a bullet point at the bottom that was missing. Oh. Keep going backwards, please. Yeah, okay, that one more forward. Sorry, we won't attempt that again. RHNA has very high standards for affordable housing, which is a good thing because we are in an affordable housing crisis in California. But the reality is cities rarely met the RHNA targets for affordable housing because there's never been enough money to subsidize the affordable housing. And affordable housing is quite expensive. And that problem is getting worse because growing income equality tends to make market rate housing even further out of reach for low-income households. And that's part of the reason we're in this affordability crisis. So, and the little bullet point at the bottom that you can't see is, quote, RHNA is broken. I have heard that said by many city staffers and one good RHNA consultant that I know. There's a kind of a wide agreement by people who have to work on RHNA that it really doesn't work. Never worked well, but now it's really broken. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and the main part of the problem started in 2017 with a bill called Senate Bill 35 by Scott Wiener. Now remember, this was the year that the legislature at Governor Jerry Brown's request put together a 15 bill housing package. And Brown said, if you put this together, I'll sign it. So unfortunately, he signed all 15 bills, including SB 35. And what SB 35 does is it starts the process of weaponizing RHNA. The bill streamlined multifamily housing project approvals ministerially in cities that failed to issue building permits for their share of the RHNA housing allocations. So first, ministerially means by right. If a developer applies for an approval, it means the city must approve it without public comment or oversight, as long as it conforms to a narrow set of objective standards. So what, SB 35 was billed as a bill to encourage affordable housing, but it also applied to market rate housing. What it says is that here's your RHNA goals. If you have not gotten permits pulled for half of those goals by the midpoint in the 8-year RHNA cycle, then housing approvals automatically become ministerial. Basically, cities lose the right to be able to have public meetings and make any other criticisms other than objective standards that were already on the books. Next slide, please. But SB 35 contained a poison pill, and that's what I just mentioned. As the League of California Cities pointed out in its veto request, a better bill would require that the trigger for ministerial approval of housing projects to be based on the number of entitled and approved applications, a process that a local agency actually controls, rather than building permits, which a developer controls and will not pull until they are ready to construct a project. This sounds nitpicky, but it's really a critical point. in the process, cities approve applications and the entitlements, and then they sit. And if a developer isn't ready for whatever reason to pull a permit and stop building, they don't. So unfortunately, the criteria for triggering ministerial approval under RHNA is not based on what cities do. It's based on what developers do. And developers may have all sorts of reasons why they don't want to pull permits, including the fact that SB 35 sets up perverse incentives. That's the expression I was looking for. Because if developers want to make sure they can get ministerial approvals, all they have, and they're close to the deadline, the midpoint deadline of 4 years, all they have to do is wait till the deadline trips over. And then after that, whenever they pull permits, they are going to be ministerial. This is a problem. Okay. But it wasn't a problem at first. Why? Because most cities met their RHNA goals for market rate housing. So SB 35 streamlining of approvals was rarely invoked for market rate housing. It could be invoked for affordable housing, but the reality is most affordable housing did not get built or approved or permits pulled because there's never enough money for the subsidies. Most cities have never met their affordable housing requirements under RHNA. But in order to weaponize SB 35, cities would have to start failing on their market rate goals as well. So what was necessary was a bill that created absurdly large requirements under RHNA for market rate housing so that cities would start failing to meet those targets as well. And once that happened, then market rate developers would also be able to get ministerial approvals. And that bill was SB 28. That was 2018. It was sponsored by the Silicon Valley Leadership Group in the Bay Area Council. It was carried by Scott Wiener, Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco. And it slipped by, although in the end, in the reconciliation vote on SB 28, it only passed by 1 vote, as I recall. So it was never a popular bill. But what was happening at the same time was the very much more explosive bill, SB 827, which got all the news and all the attention. And I remember being up in Sacramento for the hearings on SB 827. So all the focus was drawn to SB 827, which was the bill that would require cities to allow taller buildings and more density near public transportation sites. And so SB 828 kind of slipped in under the radar, unfortunately. So next slide, please. Now there's another carrot involved here. Oops, we need to run back 1 more slide, please. Too far, there we go. And this also is important. In order to meet their market rate housing goals, cities are forced to do upzoning, basically. Upzoning means they have to change zoning rules to allow bigger and taller projects on lots. But by creating a bigger development envelope, upzoning allows apartments to be built bigger, and that raises the economic value of the upzone lot. So developers like upzoning because it creates, developers and landowners, I should say, because it creates windfall increases in property values, especially for undeveloped commercial and multi-family residential lots. And sometimes cities try to claw some of this back with what is called value recapture with mixed amounts of success. So next slide, please. Okay, now for those of you who followed this issue, you may be aware of the Embarcadero Institute and Gab Layton's work on double counting in the RHNA standards. And I think she was right. I thought her work was very interesting. And the HCD's 6 cycle RHNA targets are absurd, and they were absurd even when we only had good numbers on the 4 main planning regions. Bay Area, Southern California, Sacramento, and San Diego. And I'll give you their funny acronym. Bay Area is ABAG, Southern California is SCAG, Sacramento is SACOG, and San Diego is SANDAG. So these 4 regions contain 82% of the state's population. And at that time, we knew the RHNA targets called for 870,000 new affordable units for low and very low income households, required subsidies in the range of $400 to $500 billion, and a total of 2.1 million new and affordable market rate units. This would have required building more than 250,000 units every year for 8 years. And these goals were not reasonable. And what it did was set up cities to fail for the RHNA goals not to be met, so that ministerial approvals kicked in. Now we have updated information, which I'll explain to you in the back, and it's worse. Now that we have gotten, let me back up. What happens is these big guys go first, and they have pretty straightforward processes. There's a lot of small counties and smaller cities out there across the state in rural areas and in mountainous areas. And their process takes a little longer and sometimes is on different deadlines. But now the whole state is done. And in a few moments, we'll just see what these numbers look like now. Next slide, please. All right, so due to some of the hard work of some of the folks in Cali, Julie Testa, who is on the city council in Pleasanton, and I'm blanking on Susan's last name, but Susan is on the city council in Lafayette. Susan Candell, thank you, Isaiah. They talked to their state senator, Stephen Glazer, who had formerly been a local elected. He was the mayor of the city of Orinda. And Steve Glazer worked very hard to get the legislature to approve a request to the California state auditor to issue, or rather to do an audit of the RHNA process, because we were all pretty sure something was wrong. And sure enough, the auditor came back. Overall, our audit determined that HCD does not ensure that its needs assessments are accurate and adequately supported. This insufficient oversight and lack of support for its considerations risks eroding public confidence that HCD is informing local governments of the appropriate amount of housing they will need. Yes, that's true. Next slide, please. Now here's the bad news. The state auditor has no enforcement ability. You know, it doesn't have a police force that can go arrest people in HCD and make them do their job, unfortunately. So they have to rely a lot on moral suasion, and the governor to, whoops, we're floating around here, and the governor to support their work. Can we go one more forward, please? There. And one more again to get us back where, there we go. So it's pretty much up to the governor and the legislature to keep making noise in order for the auditor's recommendations to be followed. So the auditor did make a report. It made strong recommendations and created a timeline for HCD to complete them. And several tasks needed to be undertaken between June of 2020 and February of 2023. Now, HCD has finally begun to comply, and there's a link to the state auditor's website that I will put in chat so you can see how that process is going. But it's still going to be up to the citizens to sort of stay on top of this, because RHNA is, you know, it's important, and HCD is not, I don't think HCD is going to do a great job of following up on these criticisms unless someone is paying attention. So that'll be my next job, is to try to figure out how to get engaged in this, this state audit. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Now, right now, cities are very much engaged in getting their RHNA plans done, their housing elements completed. There are some big deadlines coming. Some of you have maybe heard of this kerfluffle recently around builder's remedy. I don't think that's a huge problem, but we can talk about it later, because the huge problem still remains, even though cities do an excellent job on their housing elements and do their job on putting together the RHNA plans according to HCD guidelines and get their housing elements approved. And the deadline up here in the ABAG region is January 31st. They're still stuck with the problem that if developers don't pull permits, basically half your required permits halfway through the cycle, all the approvals become ministerial. This is a big problem now that we're going into a high interest rate regime and possibly a recession. The single family housing market is already shutting down. Developers are stopped, they're not going to keep building. How this is going to affect the multifamily housing, it's not clear yet, but we'll have to see. But anyway, housing production is going to slow down. And this, of course, is one of the problems with telling cities they have to be responsible for building housing, because cities are not the Federal Reserve. Cities don't determine interest rates. Cities don't have the power to, lower and raise interest rates to help people afford mortgages. So I think California city councils and county supervisors need to fight back. And there's a two-pronged approach. One is to stay on top of the state auditor and see what comes out of that process. But there is also the possibility of some lawsuits. And let's go to the next slide, and I'll talk about the lawsuits in a minute. Okay, now here comes the new information. And I warn you that you got to hold on, because we're going down a rabbit hole, because HCD's new goals are even more absurd. But here we go. So next slide, please. So HCD now has this very pretty website up. It's warm and fuzzy, and as I like to say, it's fuzzy in more ways than one. But this is their 2022 statewide housing plan. And if we do the next slide, it's got this very beautiful, very expensive internet interface, but it's very hard to reference that. So everything I referenced from here on out, all photos and the text, or rather the graphs and the text, are from the PDF version of this document. And it's very easy to find it, even if you don't have the link. Just Google "A Home for Every California 2200 statewide housing plan." Those first two lines in this document, you Google that and you can find all this stuff. It comes right up. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we ready? To begin to address decades of undersupply, California must plan for more than 2.5 million homes over the next 8 years, and no less than 1 million of these homes must meet the needs of lower income households. This represents more than double the housing planned for in the last 8-year cycle. These numbers are just crazy. So I'll show you why. Next slide, please. Okay, on the left, you see the old 5th cycle goals, and on the right, you see the new 6th cycle goals for the whole state. So there's several things I want to point out about these. It's typically been the case with RHNA that there's a 40%, 20%, 40% split. That is, on the bottom of these bars, 40% of the housing needs are in low and very low affordable housing. The middle bar, which is the light blue bar, which is a moderate, or what sometimes is called workforce housing, that's about 20%. Then the other final highest 40% is market rate or above moderate housing. So if you add up these two bottom bars, they're pretty much equal to the top bar. Thus, if the state is reaching its goals, there should be a 1-to-1 ratio in production of market rate housing, and deeply affordable housing. And deeply affordable, I mean these two lower bars. But that's never been achieved, and it's getting harder. And I just want to give you one example of how the state itself has screwed this up, and that is the interaction of density bonus law with the RHNA process. The state is pumping out so many new bills. I think I counted 41 on in the governor's press release just this year, that the bills interact in ways that, and there's unintended consequences, or maybe they were intended consequences. But let me tell you what's happening. The density bonus laws were started and created because they wanted a way to incentivize low-income housing by letting developers build higher for projects that had a certain amount of inclusionary affordable housing. Well, then what happened a couple of years ago is they watered down the requirements so far that they've actually become counterproductive. So for example, and we're seeing this, I've seen there's many large projects have these kind of proportions. A density bonus law says that if you provide 15% affordable for very low income housing units, you get a 50% density bonus. In other words, you can build 50% more units. So say, for example, you have a project with 100 units in it. And if you do 15 of those affordable for very low income folks, you get to build 50 more units. So now you have a project with 150 housing units, but only 15 of them are affordable. So what has happened is your effective inclusionary housing rate is down to 10%. And again, you can see this all the time now in big projects. They have about 10 to 11% affordable housing. So that's actually lower than most cities' inclusionary standards. And most cities have inclusionary standards for affordable housing of 15 to 20%. So we're actually moving in the wrong direction. So instead of having what RHNA suggests we should have, which is a 1-to-1 ratio between market rate and deeply affordable housing, the ratio is 1 to 9. So in other words, this is a joke. We are never going to even get close to producing all of this affordable housing. Now, here's the other point. The rule of thumb for affordable housing units for deeply affordable is $750,000 a unit in California. So I just want to put these numbers in proportion. So actually finding all the subsidies required by RHNA for 1 million deeply affordable housing units would cost $750 billion. Obviously, we aren't going to find that much money. But let's say because there was enough inclusionary, you could, with some optimistic but not crazy assumptions on inclusionary housing, you might get the amount of subsidies down to $600 billion. Now let's be wildly optimistic and say you found a 50% match somehow through all various federal and state programs to build this much housing. Then you'd only need $300 billion. Well, how big is $300 billion? $300 billion is the size of the total state budget, including both restricted and general fund sections of the budget. So in other words, even if under these wildly optimistic assumptions that we could somehow build all these million units for only $300 billion, that would take 1/8 of the state budget for 8 years running, basically. So again, this isn't going to happen. And anybody who knows these numbers knows it's not going to happen. And this is the funny thing I find about this presentation, which is these are all just HCD numbers and graphs from their report. And this is based on my experience as an analyst in a similar organization in Washington State. There's always deep in the bureaucracy people who care and who are conscientious and want to do a good job. And their work's not politicized. But at the high level in these agencies, Governor Newsom has politicized HCD. He made a fool of himself by promising 3.5 million housing units when he was running against Villa Ragosa for governor. I think he wants to save face. I think he wants to say he's figured out the housing crisis if and when he runs for president.
That may be beyond my abilities at the moment.
Sorry, that was Siri. But there's a disconnect in this document between the graphs and the data, which are good, and I suspect the staff created those graphs, and the verbiage, which is totally political and crazy. So let's go on to the next graph. You'll see what I mean. This graph, maybe some of you have seen. It's data that I think it originates with something called Serve California. No, it's Construction Industry Research Board. So these are the permits issued all the way back to 1980 up through 2020 in California. Now, remember, if you're doing 2.5 million housing units in 8 years, you need to be a little over 300,000 housing units a year. And there's a line in this graph, if you can see it, it's the higher black line that says units needed. And that is right about 310 housing units or permitted units a year. And note that in the last several decades in California, that level of housing production was only achieved in 1 year, back in 1986. And since then, there's been economic ups and downs. In 2008 to 2010, you see the bars really collapse. That was the Great Recession. And since then, housing has come back a little bit, but not much. We're basically producing about 100,000 housing units a year. So what HCD is telling us is that in order to meet their goals, even though the construction industry, the residential construction industry in California was decimated by the Great Recession, we are going to magically triple our housing production up to a level we've only ever reached in 1 year in the state of California in 1986. And we're going to hold it there steady for 8 years. That's what their numbers mean. And that's what somebody who put together this graph is trying to tell us, that, you know, this is not going to happen. This is crazy. And it gets worse because you see that the dark bars, the ones on the bottom, the blue ones, are units in single family structures. The green ones are units in multifamily structures. With the increase in interest rates, last data point I have is mortgage interest rates are above 7% now, and they're as high as they have been since 2002. That's going to cause a collapse, and it's causing a collapse in the single-family residential construction market. So these blue bars are probably going to shrink pretty dramatically in the next, during the RHNA cycle. So that's going to make it even tougher to try to build enough housing units. Yeah, next slide, please. Now this one is interesting. Remember, RHNA started as a planning process. And this shows you sort of what happens in the process between the RHNA requirements for planning and then how many units actually get built, where the drop-off is. Well, actually, the cities do a pretty good job because they pretty much meet the target for RHNA. The cities, they do their RHNAs, they do their housing elements, and they pretty much zone for what is expected. But then when it comes to pulling permits, there's a huge drop-off. And remember, cities don't pull permits, developers pull permits. So there's a huge drop-off when developers pull permits. But that can be for two reasons. One is because they decide they just don't want to build for whatever reason, because they can't get loans, the interest rates are bad, there's a labor shortage. There's a lot of reasons for that. Building housing is complicated. Now, part of it is also they just can't get the land, because even though, cities zone for RHNA, cities are not the property owners. Cities have some property, not very much. The state has more. There's been a lot of work lately to try to get housing built on those properties. In my city of Albany, we are doing that. But cities don't control property owners. If property owners are happy doing what they're doing, or they're hanging on to their properties because they see them as good investments, just as in a vacant lot. We have a couple of those in Albany. There's no gun that you can hold to property owners' heads to get them to market their properties, and there's no gun you can hold to developers' heads to get them to build. Now, just one caveat: the 6th cycle RHNA does have some requirements that cities prove that the lots that they include in their RHNA goals are actually developable, but there's some reasonable probability that they get developed. However, as we go down this chain, you see that even though developers pull a lot of permits, they don't build all of the units. So permitted projects oftentimes don't get built at all. So we end up between the RHNA goals and what going down this chain to what units get built, the attrition rate is overall is greater than 50%. So I don't know who put this chart together there in the bowels of bureaucracy to HCD, but it's a great chart. I'm glad someone had the gumption to do that. All right, so next slide, please. Now we switch to the verbiage, which is the politicized stuff that the people at the top are writing. More than just being a high number or an aspirational goal, the new housing need RHNA target is a legal obligation that cities and counties must abide by, a legal obligation. The state helps cities and counties meet this goal through a combination of funding for housing planning and implementation activities, education, and technical assistance. While education and technical assistance is always the first step in the state's accountability efforts, the state holds jurisdictions accountable for their housing obligations and compliance with state housing laws. Okay, first of all, as a nitpicky science editor, you'll notice that education and technical assistance is a compound subject. Therefore, the verb should be plural. So this should be while education and technical assistance are always the first steps in the accountability efforts. You know, this is a little bit sloppy, and their thinking is also a little bit sloppy. And then this last one, I don't know if you can see all of it, but I'll read it, the whole thing for you. Through the implementation of a number of meaningful accountability reforms passed by the legislature and signed by the governor in recent years, California's 2.5 million unit target is no longer a paper exercise. It is an expectation for the housing, permitting, and construction of new housing units. Now remember, when SB 828 was passed, the League of California Cities knew this was coming, and they tried to point out to the governor in their veto request that RHNA was never supposed to be about production. It was a planning process. And here we are a few years later, with all of a sudden, cities are supposed to be legally accountable for production. And that's an interesting catch. So if you go on to the next slide, please. This is my last slide. Oops, I'm sorry, one back. You went two there. One more down. One more. No, there's one in the middle. You know what? I can just read it to you. It's short. So here is the final absurd statement from oops. Oh, wait a minute. I take that back. You're right. That was my last slide. So my apologies. So here we go. Let's talk about production goals. Some of you may remember back in the old Soviet Union, they had 5-year plans that were also production targets. But that makes sense for the Soviet Union to have state production targets because it was a command economy. The state owned the means of production in a command economy. But it doesn't make so much sense for the United States economy because the United States has a market-based economy with decentralized private ownership of the means of production, and they have private property. So unlike in the Soviet Union, our state and municipal governments don't have authority to order private producers to produce anything at all, much less to produce, or much less to meet absurd goals. And here's an analogy. Let's say the state ordered municipalities to do rain dances so that it would rain. And when it didn't rain, they punish us because it didn't rain. And now I would hope that that would be illegal because cities and local governments don't control whether or not it rains. But you know what? Cities and local governments don't really control whether or not housing is produced either, not in a market economy. It's a decentralized decision. So I have a question, and somebody mentioned this to me a couple of weeks ago and got me thinking about this. I think HCD is pushing legal boundaries. If they say cities are legally required for production, when does that cross a line? And if they punish us because we don't produce enough, at what point is that really no longer legal? Because I don't think you can hold people legally responsible for things that they don't control. And we don't really control what our private sector does. And my last point is, in my humble opinion, the private sector can't and won't ever be a reliable partner to solve the state's affordable housing crisis. And at some point, if the public wants affordable housing built, the public has to start building it itself, because otherwise our political and economic system is not really designed to respond to these kind of needs. So I think we need to move on in Sacramento and dispense with RHNA, dispense with trying to tweak market rate housing and focus on just having the public build affordable housing. And that's my pitch. And I think there is one more slide that you can see. Oops, I think Rick shut it off. Anyway, I have a slide in here that has some of the links. I managed to put the first two in chat, but we'll figure out how to put them in chat, or frankly, you can pretty much find these just by using Google. But in any case, like I said, that's it. So I am open to questions, and thank you for indulging me for what was too long. Oh, thank you, Jennifer, whoever you are.
Thank you, Michael.